Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm delighted to have you join us today for our program, Meeting the Challenge of Video Preservation, Big Collections, Bold Solutions. I'm Brenda Bernier. I am the Malloy-Rabinowitz Preservation Librarian and Director of Preservation Services in Harvard Library. And we are excited to share with you today some details about a pilot project to preserve and provide access to thousands of videotapes using what is called a mass digitization technique. So let me give you a brief outline of today's events. I will start us out with a little context about AV preservation. Then my colleague Ann Whiteside, Assistant Dean for Information Services at Francis Loeb Library, Harvard's Graduate School of Design, will give you some background about our AV vendor pilot. Doug Gragg, Harvard Divinity School Librarian, will tell you about the fantastic collection that we are digitizing with this pilot. Then Ann will return and be joined by our colleague Kaylie Ackerman, Head of Media Preservation Services for our Harvard Library. And they will discuss some of the challenges that we had to overcome in the process. At the end, we will have a question and answer session. So throughout our presentations, please enter questions for our speakers using the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your Zoom window. So I'd like to share with you a personal encounter that I had that had taught me about the power of AV materials. So during the pandemic, my father passed away. And like a lot of people, when they lose a loved one, they go through photographs. So I went through a lot of photographs, and I'm a photograph conservator by training, so photographs especially appeal to me. But I had one videotape of him. And in it, I could hear his sweet, quirky French-Canadian accent. And it really helped me appreciate a little bit more the memory of him and had a little more insight about who he is as a person. So it really helped me appreciate also how we can connect with AV materials. And when I think of Harvard's collections, the fantastic, unique collections, for example, we have the first known audio recording of JFK. We have poets who are reading their poetry in the cadence and intonation that they imagined. We have field recordings of disappearing languages. And we have lectures by prominent faculty and guests in you name what field, so many fields. So Harvard has somewhere around 500,000 rare and unique pieces of physical AV. And one of the difficulty of AV materials, especially videotape, is that they are very fragile and the equipment needed to play them is obsolete and hard to get. Sometimes we only have one shot at playing a piece of tape. And if we're doing that, if we're taking that one shot, we might as well digitize it by a professional for preservation and for access. And in thinking of access, we have to imagine and plan for the possibility of using, say, artificial intelligence or other technology to discover this content and to make use of it in new ways. So one of the challenges we have is time. It's the time we have left to digitize, and it's the time it takes to digitize. So we know we have a dwindling window of time to preserve these materials due to, as I mentioned, their fragility and obsolescence. Our goal is to maximize our effort over the next 10 years. And in terms of digitization, there's a one-to-one time relationship. So for example, 1 hour of content would take at least 1 hour to digitize. So you can extrapolate that in your own head to 450,000 pieces. So we're fortunate that we have in-house expertise through our AV media preservation services. So we have expertise in AV preservation. But you can imagine at this scale, that's too much for any one department. So we have to start thinking about banks of equipment, meaning mass digitization, where we have a single operator digitizing multiple tapes at once. And we think this can be successful because this technique has been successful at Indiana University through the use of a specialized vendor. So here at Harvard, the library has formed an AV mass digitization working group to investigate if mass digitization could be an option for some of our collections and what it would take to do that. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Ann Whiteside, who is my co-convener for the Mass Digitization Working Group, and she will give you some context for our vendor pilot. Ann.
Thank you, Brenda. Hello, everybody. The charge our group was given was to guide the Harvard Library in developing and implementing an initiative for media digitization, discovery, access, and preservation at a scale that reflects the results of the library-wide 2018 AV survey that Brenda mentioned. That survey told us that collectively we have over 450,000 items. Approximately 51% of those are video, and these should potentially be reformatted to preserve them and make them accessible. To approach this, a pilot project is being undertaken to help us understand the many different workflows and processes required to make the work scalable to allow us to preserve and make accessible the vast numbers of videos that we have. The pilot team began work in 2019 with representation from Media Preservation Services, Harvard Library committees that include Collections, Access, Stewardship, Harvard Library Finance, Technical Services, and the Divinity School. The overall work plan is to perform digitization and provide accessibility to a specific video collection at a large scale so that we can devise workflows that will be scalable with higher numbers of videos. We are working with the Carlton Pearson collection from the Divinity School, which you will hear more about in a few minutes. And the collection is comprised of several thousand videos in different formats. The pilot helps us test workflows from identifying what to digitize through transporting videos around campus to the digitization process, receipt back to Harvard, and then how to make them accessible for viewing. The Pearson collection also, because of its multiple formats, allows us to test these strategies with the different formats. We are working our way through the next phases of the pilot now, which is to send larger batches of 1,000 videos for digitization to our vendor. These phases are expansions of the process that we began earlier this year, and we can test our workflow processes further. Whereas earlier in the year, we sent a couple of batches of 100 videos, we are now multiplying that out. At the end of the pilot, we will have identified what each of the needed processes are to fulfill the work of digitization at scale. We will understand how to deploy resources across Harvard Library to create workflows and processes, and to create a roadmap that plans for digitization of our vast video collections in need of preservation. I'm now going to turn this over to our colleague, Doug Gragg from the Divinity School.
Hello, everybody. Anne has said a brief word about some of the reasons why this collection from the Divinity Library was selected for the pilot, and may say more about that from a technical standpoint. But I just want to tell you a little bit about the collection itself, about the person, Carlton Pearson, and also about why we acquired this for the Divinity Library, the process that led to that acquisition, which was in 2016, so a few years ago. And so, but to get us started, I'm going to ask Grace to run a short 1-minute clip that will give you a taste of who this figure is. This is from one of the videos that we've already digitized.
Bless you, precious. Amen. Glenda Watson. I don't know how many days she'll be in town, or you leave tomorrow morning. Bless your heart. Well, these people have so many questions to ask you. And, they can ask you afterward. Buy a donkey. Do you know what that means? Helen told me to say that. I forgot what it meant. It means thank you. Oh, I knew that. I was just checking to see if you knew it. Well, I hope you'll seize the moment. This is an exciting moment to be alive. This is a great day. You know, all I have to offer you is promise. Promise of a good future. Promise of a positive future with all of the prophetic warnings of bad times for the world. And those things will increase because Scripture promises as such. But for the church, we rise.
Well, that is the charismatic Carlton Pearson, probably from in his 40s or late 40s, early 50s. He is a household name among some circles, and let me just tell you a little bit about him. If I can get my, there we go. So Carlton Pearson got his start in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He went to Oral Roberts University, well-known university founded by the evangelist Oral Roberts, associated with the Church of God in Christ, one of the early large Pentecostal denominations. And as an African-American student and young preacher, many began to see him as perhaps Oral Roberts' protege. They had great plans for him, and as a leader, you saw a taste of his charisma in that one little clip from his congregation. But he, in fact, founded a 6,000 member church in Tulsa, and hosted a weekly national television program. He was the host of an annual Azusa conference in Tulsa. Azusa Street in California, Los Angeles, was the birthplace of the modern Pentecostal movement. And so this conference was a gathering of folks from all over the country and even the world, with him as host. And he himself was a popular speaker around the country, across the country and abroad. So very dynamic figure, very successful minister, person of great promise. But into the third decade of his career, he had what I guess we could call a crisis of conscience. He began to have second thoughts about some very basic evangelical doctrines. In particular, he was concerned that he didn't feel that a loving God, as Christianity proclaims, could eternally punish someone to hell. So he began to doubt whether hell was a reality. And he decided to go public with these views. And in fact, eventually published a book that he called The Gospel of Inclusion. And this book was, in fact, the beginning of the end for his stellar career. The response was immediate. The hammer came down hard. He was declared a heretic by his denominational leaders and defrocked of his ordination. His congregation began to abandon him, and eventually he lost it when the numbers got too small for them to be able to continue to pay the rent on the building and such. And so in essence, he felt like his career had pretty much come to an end. Here he was, a young man around 50 years old, but everything came crashing down. So at that point, he packed up all of the materials related to his ministry, the extensive records, papers, film reels of his former ministry, and stored them away in a Tulsa warehouse, and began to ask himself, well, what's next for me? Eventually, he came to the notice of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is a rather liberal denomination, particularly because he had become essentially a Universalist himself. believing that everyone is saved in the end. And later, he was in fact invited to join the ministerial staff of the All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa to try to start over again at 55, roughly 55 years old. Intriguing figure. If you're interested in knowing more about him, you can watch this film that came out in 2018, sponsored by Netflix, Come Sunday. It's a nicely done film. Chiwetel Ejiofor plays Pearson, and Martin Sheen plays Oral Roberts. It's a very sensitive and sympathetic portrayal of his rise and then his fall. But the question you may be asking is, what does this have to do with Harvard? Why would we be interested in that? And that's where two Harvard professors enter the picture, Jonathan Walton and Marla Frederick. Jonathan was the minister of the Harvard Memorial Church and a professor at the Divinity School. Marla, at the time, was professor of African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, particularly religious aspects. And both of them had developed an interest in Carlton Pearson as a figure. Jonathan was writing a book on his rise and fall, but also the phenomenon of Pentecostalism and televangelism in American religion as an important slice of that form of religion. And so they and some of their graduate students and colleagues were very interested in this work. Jonathan discovered that Pearson had squirreled away this vast archive of materials related to his ministry. And so he got in touch with him and said, I'd like to come out and view these materials. So he did, made several trips out to Tulsa, and came back telling Marla and others, this is a treasure trove. This is just the kind of thing that scholars and journalists just ache to get access to, because it's financial records, it's all sorts of things that would be of interest. It's the film footage, lots of film footage, contracts, correspondence, et cetera, et cetera. So Jonathan and Marla came to us at the library and said, is there any way that we can make a deal with Carlton Pearson to get this archive at Harvard? So we began the process. I reached out to his agency, and Jonathan and I invited him to come out to Harvard. We met with him in the library, as you see here. The dean of the Divinity School became involved, and on his visit, he wined and dined Carlton and his wife, Gina, and we negotiated. Some other fallen televangelists, as you may know from the news reports, sometimes have sold their archives, their records, for large amounts of money. And so we feared that might be a roadblock. But when we made the case to him that this would be valuable for his legacy, valuable for scholars throughout the country who are interested in studying this form of religion in America, he agreed, and he decided he would donate the collection to us with the help of our legal experts here. We worked out an agreement that based on a Creative Commons license, which means that anything that he had copyright control over, we would be free in the collection. We would be free to digitize, make available publicly at no charge for scholars to access and use and reuse for their own work. So it was a wonderful gift and a wonderful opportunity for Harvard. We actually made the front page of the Boston Globe that year, shortly after his visit. And this little clip from that article, he describes this archive as the record of my existence on this planet. So he had great emotional attachment to it, and was so pleased to see it put in a place where it could be cared for and made available to scholars. There's also a description here of the size. It was 300 crates of video footage, musical recordings, photos, notes, financial records, When transferred into archival boxes, it's roughly 800 boxes. It's the largest collection that the Divinity School Library has ever taken in as a gift into our archival collections, and one of the largest at Harvard. So we were delighted to get it and very pleased that it was selected for this pilot project. So why did we acquire this collection at Harvard? You already know part of the answer because I introduced Jonathan Marlowe to you. But so it's to support the research of scholars and students who are working on this important segment of American religious life. It's full of financial records and contracts from a major televangelistic enterprise, something that's very rare to get one's hands on. It involves correspondence with other prominent religious leaders and with senior politicians. We understand that he was an advisor at some level to both Presidents Bush, father and son, and to Bill Clinton. There's also film footage in both raw and edited form. So someone interested in the development of television programming of this sort can see what the footage was, and then how it was crafted into a program with impact. But another reason is that it also helped us to expand further the diversity of our archival holdings. As you may know, Harvard Divinity School is historically strong in its holdings in Protestant Christianity of a more liberal variety. As we've tried to expand our holdings in the archives to include a broader array, this certainly helped us in that regard. It gives us some very important primary materials from evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity. It gives an opportunity for exploring the intersection of African American and European American Christianities as he rose in what had been traditionally a white European Christianity as a rising star, and then of course just these extensive multimedia materials. So it made sense for us to get the collection. It took us 4 years to work through it and create a finding aid, which was posted earlier this year. And we've already had a number of scholars use the print materials, the paper materials, where this pilot project will make over the next year or so the film footage available, at least some of it, for their use as well. And Kaylie will tell you a little bit more about the process from here, but our job on this end as the owning repository is to pack and get ready for shipment these shipments of 1,000 items. So here's a sample of what this was the first shipment. We've sent 2 now. We have a 3rd underway now, but this is a huge undertaking. So once we get this done, then they take it over from there. So on to back to Anne and to Kaylie.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to now talk at a high level about some of the challenges that we are encountering in the pilot and what we are learning from those challenges that will help us in the future. I'm focusing mostly on logistical challenges, and Kaylie will pick up after me and talk about some of the technical things that we are learning as well. So some of the things that we think about, that we've been thinking about include copyright ownership, which Doug alluded to a little bit, sorting the videos into formats to batch them by format, packing them, and you saw one picture that Doug showed of what that looks like, tracking the workflow that tracks through multiple units plus the vendor, shipping, and we've learned about the need for co-locating the activity of the shipping, the preparation for shipping, and then sending the items out, and ensuring that all stakeholders are kept apprised of the project. This includes Harvard Library, our vendor, the University of Southern California, our digital repository service colleagues, Aviary, which is an access platform vendor, as well as the digitization vendor. So while we are still in the pilot phase, we are learning a number of things that we apply to each step of the pilot project, and we will be able to apply to the larger overall project. This includes understanding that we have stakeholders across the university that we engage with, such as facility staff at the Divinity School, as well as other facility staff across Harvard, in order to move materials to their destinations. It includes consulting with copyright experts as we assess our ability to make the videos available. It includes tracking workflows between multiple Harvard units, as well as with our vendor. We have also learned that there are times when the work must be co-located, particularly when you're talking about shipping the videos off to the vendor. We are also assessing the pilot workflows for scalability, noting how long certain processes take now and factoring that time out over larger numbers. Yes, there are challenges, and this is also very gratifying work because we are working to make large-scale impact for Harvard students, faculty, and alumni, and researchers around the world. As my colleague Brenda said, this is a big, ambitious project, and we know how to do it. We know we need to do it as well. And we know there is a voracious demand for the content because researchers use it as soon as it is made available. I'm going to now turn this over to Kaylie to finish that perspective.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the technical challenges in the preservation of AV material, and particularly as they pertain to mass digitization. As you've already probably surmised from my colleagues, AV media is a ticking time bomb due to the obsolescence of the technologies required to properly reproduce and replay it. The short history of recorded sound and video overflows with a variety of unique formats numbering in the hundreds. Around these formats, the professional sound, video, and film industries develop nuanced working methods, most of which are poorly documented outside the realms of professional common knowledge and folklore. As formats have aged, so too have the population of professionals who carry that knowledge, compounding the problems of obsolescence that media preservation activities like mass digitization face. As a result, it's often difficult to find workers who have direct experience with some of the formats that must be digitized. And of course, the other problem is the formats themselves. Preservation of obsolete media involves a complex set of tasks that carry risk. Those risks include format loss of information, loss of fidelity in the format, the potential to introduce errors into the recording by some error in the process, or even the total loss of the items themselves. Some formats are straightforward in their conceptual design and therefore are easily fitted into a mass digitization workflow. Others are nuanced in ways that the format could have been recorded used, making them difficult to put into a work stream, like mass digitization, without a considerable amount of work to vet the format or to inspect the items. Reel-to-reel audio tape, for example, utilizes differing track configurations, different track widths, different tape speeds, a range of electronic calibrations that make it anything but a simple format to reproduce. And much of that information is hidden data that's only discovered through time-consuming direct inspection on an item-by-item basis. The next slide. This is a 24-track 2-inch tape recording. There's not many of these in the Harvard Library collections, but there are a few. Things that make this clear that this would not be a candidate for mass digitization include the fact that it has Dolby SR noise reduction. This is the pinnacle of noise reduction technology during the peak of the analog recording era. And it was very sensitive to calibration variances and also something we only found really in upper echelon recording studios, which means that if you have a tape that's encoded this way, the probability is high that it's of high commercial value and that it's an original recording. The fact that this is Ampex 456, that's a tape formulation that's famous for exhibiting what's called sticky shed syndrome. These tapes require special treatment to avoid scraping the magnetic particles off the tape binder when you just put it on a tape machine to play it. It's a 24-track tape. That means that there's special handling required to ensure all the content is retrieved and usable, and it requires more extensive quality control as a result. The presence of SMPTE timecode also suggests that this tape was part of a system that was synchronizing playback from multiple sources, which is also a complicating factor. And then finally, the fact that there's an 8-inch floppy in this box is never a good sign for preservation. In this case, the disk contains automation and track metadata from an SSL series mixing console. In other words, it contains the data specifying what volume each track should be played at, where each is located in the stereo sound field, and possibly information, about signal processing that was applied through the mixing board. And it conveys this information in a data format that hasn't been widely readable since the late 1990s, when the floppy itself was already obsolete by a matter of decades. So, if I haven't scared you off yet, let me talk a little bit about what kinds of materials are suited for mass digitization. First, just so everyone's clear, mass digitization is when one operator digitizes many items simultaneously. It is most successful when the content being digitized shares common characteristics such as format, runtime, equalization, and so on. And one way to identify such media is by finding items that were created in a controlled, standards-based workflow. That means that selection of content is based not only on the intellectual value, but also on its technical fitness for a particular digitization approach. Although quality control and quality assurance are frequently used interchangeably, they aren't actually the same. Quality assurance is the steps that we take to set up the project for success. This includes designing digitization specifications that will produce content that can meet the needs of the Harvard Library community far into the future, as well as designing workflows that will minimize the collection's risk exposure throughout that process. This involves setting guidelines for personnel, training, specifying best practices, what kind of equipment must be used, and so on. And it certainly includes workflows for evaluating, qualifying, and selecting media from a workflow like mass digitization. So one way to think about this is to pose the question, which path forward gets the most high value content digitized for preservation in the shortest time frame, hopefully at the lowest cost and with the least amount of unnecessary risk. Having a mass digitization process redo the same item over and over again, that's not a good use of that resource. And it puts the item potentially at higher risk. But doing everything in a traditional one-to-one workflow ensures that a vast amount of content will be left behind. So we need both approaches, and we need to be efficient in how we sort media into the appropriate workflows. Mass digitization as a process, as I said, is successful when lots of like objects are processed, which aren't too complex. For the pilot project, this was the overwhelming reason why selecting the Pearson collection worked for us from a technical perspective. The collection is mostly from a single broadcast facility. The content is uniform in the sense that it's mostly on-air program material. There's a small number of format variants that follow a logical progression of the commonly used formats in broadcast during the years in which it was created. Broadcast work tends to be much more standards-based than, say, the work of collectors or field recordists. And it tends not to have tapes that run at non-standard tape speeds or have multiple programs on the same tape. So in short, it's the ideal collection for mass digitization, which is a process itself that was born out of the needs of broadcast archives in the first place. So the Pearson collection has an acceptable degree of uniformity, and it has just enough variance, 3 formats in total, that we could begin to explore the processes for how to aggregate batches that take advantage of the strengths of mass digitization. Harvard certainly has many more collections that exhibit many of these same salient qualities. And next steps are to build and expand out workflows for qualifying these collections with a level of reliability that enables us to take advantage of mass digitization while still managing the risk to the collections. Even items that are well suited to mass digitization can still fail in the process. And that's why we also need a robust quality control program for assessing the post-digitization results. Initial investigations of the first several batches that have gone out to the vendor show a failure rate of about 15%. Thankfully, due to the work that was done to qualify that media through condition assessments, none of those resulted in catastrophic damage to the media itself. And those are items that can now be rerouted into a one-to-one digitization workflow for completion. Lastly, I just want to say just a couple words about quality control. There's really 2 broad categories of QC. Automated QC, like what the screen shows here, that's using software to examine files to ensure they're meeting the technical characteristics that we have specified to a vendor. And then there's human-intensive QC, direct examination to ensure that the digitized content is an accurate reflection of the original media item. The latter kind of QC may identify issues that we weren't able to screen out in the pre-qualification process, like maybe there is a program change that we missed in midstream on a format, or maybe it was replayed in a way that was in some way suboptimal. Maybe the sound wasn't recorded or something along those lines, or even that it was just incorrectly excluded from the digitization process by a mistake. QC, we should have a base level of uniformity in its application, but we should also think about how we can use it as a resource that we apply dynamically as the project progresses. Factors for that might be things like curatorial value of some materials over others, or other risk factors like maybe increasing attention to new processes in a workflow, or increasing attention when there's a changeover in staffing, or perhaps when they start a new format. These are measures that are essential to fulfilling our role as preservation stewards of the vast wealth that is the Harvard Library AV collections. So now I'd like to turn it back to Brenda for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kaylie. If I would have my colleagues Kaylie, Ann, and Doug join me. Thank you. And please do continue to add questions in the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. We have a few, and we received a few ahead of time. And I noticed that some were a little bit similar, so I may edit a few together to get the gist of the question. So I think we'd like to start with Ann. There's a question about how or why did we choose the vendor that we chose?
That's a great question, Brenda, and to whoever asked it. One of the reasons we chose the vendor was that it's a vendor that has worked with Indiana University, as has been stated. And so we knew that there was a track record of what they were able to do. And we also had some similar ideas about what we're trying to do is not that vastly different from what Indiana did. They also were doing mass digitization at huge scale. And so that gave us some ideas that this vendor might be a good vendor. There are very, very few vendors who can do this kind of work at scale. So that's another factor. And we met with the vendor and talked to them a lot about what our goals were and how we were trying to approach this and what we want to be able to do eventually in the long run. And through that process, also started developing the relationship with the vendor, which led us to feel that they would be a good partner to work with on this project.
Okay. Thank you, Anne.
I just want to add, not to mention that they have the banks of machines that allow the mass digitization to be very effective. Sorry, that's an important point.
Good point. Thank you, Anne. There are a number of questions about the video formats, the digital formats that are appropriate for this kind of endeavor, and questions about what happens when they become outmoded. Will we need to reconvert them periodically? So I'm going to turn to Kaylie to take on that question. Oh, you're muted.
Unmute me. There we go. Sorry. In terms of the format, so Harvard Library has a number of video formats that it supports as a digital preservation standard. The reason for that is just that video comes to us in many different ways, and we didn't want to create bigger files to accommodate things that were preservation worthy already as they were. So, but in terms of what are the formats? So we support uncompressed QuickTime. We support JPEG 2000 lossless, and we support all flavors of ProRes and a few others. So in terms of the Divinity project, we decided to use ProRes 422 for that. Given an evaluation of the original content, which there's a lot of VHS, for example, that format is sufficient to capture the quality that is on most of those tapes. And then in terms of migration or what to do in the future, if ProRes becomes obsolete, yes, then we would have to migrate the data. And so one of the things that we do with the preservation repository is we try to monitor on an ongoing basis, the health, if you will, of the various formats that we support for preservation. And so when it becomes necessary to update a file format because it's become obsolete, then that's something that's planned and strategically carried out by the Harvard Library. And we've done a couple of these migrations already in the history of the digital repository service, particularly around audio and the streaming formats that we were using.
Thank you, Kaylie. I think that leads nicely into another small cluster of questions we're getting about the digital preservation part, the digital storage, and what is our plan for that. So Kaylie, can I turn it back over to you?
Sure. So for the digital storage, Harvard has a digital repository service in-house that is created and maintained by the Library Technical Services team. That is one of the preservation repositories that is probably most used for AV at the moment for Harvard Library. But we also have other options that we rely on. So one is there's a preservation repository maintained at USC. And so that's an alternative option. And we are going to leverage both repositories during this project for this pilot. So some of the copies will go into the USC archive and some of them will go into the digital repository service here at Harvard.
And Kaylie, sorry, I apologize. I was trying to read the questions as they came in. Did you mention the DRS futures at all?
I didn't. Did you want to talk about that, Brenda?
Well, all I want to say is that right now we are at the timing of this pilot is really good with the strategic thinking about the future of digital preservation and the future of our digital repository service, which is, it's 20 years old, so it's time for a rethink. And so having and knowing that we have a lot of influx of AV materials coming in to the system will enable us to plan for it a little bit more strategically. So I'd say the timing is actually quite good for that.
I agree.
Okay. We have some very specific questions. For example, if a video fails in the vendor-generated digitization process, do you send it back to the vendor for remediation, or do you automatically move that item in-house?
I think it depends on how it fails in terms of that. If it's a question of the vendor made an obvious error, like they forgot to digitize part of it, or they only digitized the video but not the audio, or some kind of problem like that, then yes, we would push it back to them and ask them to remediate it. If the problem is more intrinsic in the video item itself, meaning the tape is failing in some spectacular way, then the vendor is really oriented towards this mass production workflow. And we would prefer to take a video like that and put it into our one-to-one workflow, where it can get the kind of care that will greatly increase the odds of it being digitized successfully without, without losing the content. So that's how I think about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a deeper dive question into the when you talk about migration and converting to new formats. The question is, could you answer about going back to video to reconvert to a new conversion has risks versus converting one digital format to another, which will likely reduce fidelity? So I think they're asking, are you going back to the original video to reconvert versus just migrating the digital file?
Right. So, our policy is in any AV preservation activity to create a high quality master recording of some kind, whether it's uncompressed or very lightly compressed, like a high res ProRes format, for example. That becomes our archival master. And then we may produce an intermediary where, let's say the sound was really noisy or messed up in some way, and we could remediate that in some way to make that video more accessible. We might create another high-res master where we made those changes. And then beneath that, we would have a delivery copy. And so when we make a new delivery copy, if there is an intermediary that corrects some flaw in the recording, we would probably roll back to that version, which would still be, in terms of video encoding, would still be basically the same quality as the original item. Or absent that file, we would go back to the original archival master.
Okay, great. So they're asking, a person's asking, is there consideration of transcription of the audio in conjunction with digitizing the video?
It's a great question. It's something we talk about a lot in our planning, and we haven't gotten to a place where we have a final answer on that yet. But what I will say is, in just the time that we started this pilot, we've gone from costing out what it would cost to do that with a third-party vendor who would provide a speech-to-text conversion and then human intervention to clean up, to starting discussions around what could ChatGPT do for us with transcription. So while it's tempting to jump in and just commit resources to doing that right away, there might be some advantages to hanging back just a little bit on the edge of that and seeing if technology can leapfrog our current situation where it's very, very costly to engage a vendor to close caption this much material.
Great, thank you. Thank you. There has been a request if maybe the formats that you mentioned earlier, Kaylie, could go into the chat or be sent out later to the participants. So we'll have to, look into that. Okay, I'm not seeing any more there. We did have a question that came in earlier how can we educate the general public on videotape preservation? So for example, to get to the people with tapes in their attics and basements and storage spaces.
Did you want me to take that?
Yeah, I don't mind.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the two things I thought about when I read that question were something called Home Movie Day, which is kind of an organized effort that takes place on an annual basis. And there's a website that I'm hoping Jorge can throw into the chat for
He
us.
just did. Yeah.
Yeah, which has some resources that are really aimed at you know, lay people who have personal AV collections that might want to preserve them or work with them in some way. And then there's another resource that hopefully he can add from an organization called YASA. And they are a more technical organization, and they cater more towards large institutions and vendors and so on. But the information that they make available free on the web is really spectacular. And I would point anybody who has an interest in this topic to their resources.
Great. Okay. We still have a few more minutes. A couple people in the chat mentioned the challenges that they've had when they've had videotape with mold. And I'm gonna use my layman's response was, oh, I feel your pain, because when that does happen, it's complicated because it's hard to find a vendor who is willing to take it and who is willing to copy that material or clean that material in a way that doesn't compromise their own equipment. Kaylie, do you have any deeper insights beyond my blithe observation?
Well, I mean, mold is extremely problematic with AV because, like, it's not like just wiping off your photograph or something. A lot of times mold will pack into the wind of a tape, or you know, depends on the object you're talking about, but it can be very labor intensive to safely remove that mold. And there's only, as I think, as you just said, there's only a handful of vendors who will even approach that project. If I could pivot just a little and say there's other things that we clean videotape from, and I saw the question earlier, and they talked about machines and winding through them with like a pelham or some kind of material to lift material off the tape. Just so it's clear, we do operations like that all the time with video, without mold. You know, it's just to pick up debris and whatever may have settled on the tape, whether it's dust or other materials. But mold is very tricky. So I don't have good answers for it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a good question. Okay, I don't see any more open questions.
Brenda, could I return to one of the earlier questions? And I wanted to wait to make sure that we had enough time left. Regarding storage of these materials, and Kaylie explained, you know, how this works from a technical standpoint. As someone who is in charge of the budget for my library, in case we have listeners who have cost in mind, I would just say that it's always a good idea to do cost comparisons, because there are a variety of cost models out there. Kaylie mentioned both the USC and our own repository, and because of just different cost models and I guess various other factors that are probably beyond my ken, there can be a tremendous cost differential. So, for example, the preservation copies that are made out of this pilot will be stored at USC because they're larger, and at about a 90% saving over what it would cost to store those same files here. Then the use copies, the access copies, will be stored here at a much lower cost. So it's certainly something to consider. These files are huge, as you might imagine, as compared to other digitized files of print materials, for example. So that's something also to keep in mind.
Thank you. Anne or Kaylie, do you have any other last thoughts?
Well, I guess I would just add on to Doug's comment and say that, not only is it a distortion, but it also drove some of the decision-making around the format. So the difference between an uncompressed QuickTime 10-bit video file and a ProRes 422 file is significant. And, the cost to store those extra bits, I think if you're not going to see an appreciable increase in capability in the resulting file, you really have to consider that and think about going with something that is maybe from a purity standpoint, not as appealing. I mean, uncompressed is very appealing in a lot of ways, but on the other hand, ProRes 422 is the mainstay format of television and film, and nobody's complaining about what they're seeing there. And so I think it's a very viable format, and it has such significant market penetration that I'm very confident that it's not going away anytime soon as well. So those are just some of the considerations I'd add to Doug's remarks.
Thank you, Kaylie.
I would just add that that the topic of making choices about preservation levels is something that we've started conversations with our curators across campus. We've started those conversations earlier, and we will pick those up again towards the end of the pilot, because Doug raised some very good points and Kaylie's raised some very good points about there's cost, and then there's what is it that you need to use the files for. And those are some of the considerations that we want to help people understand as they make decisions as we go through mass digitization.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, we are at time. I want to thank you all again for attending. We have recorded this event, so if you enjoyed it and you want to share it with a friend, you'll be able to do so in just a few days. I want to thank today's presenters for sharing their expertise with us. And I also would like to thank my colleagues who worked behind the scenes to make this event happen. That's Grace Strong, Brooke Gilmore, Jorge Rodriguez, and Francisca Frey. Thank you all, and I wish you a lovely afternoon.